Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Ernesto sat down on the bench and reached into his pocket for cigarettes. The man remembered that he had quit smoking a month ago when his daughter was diagnosed with the dreadful disease. Why her? Why not me? He repeated to himself. Lord, if you're there, in heaven, why would you allow such an injustice? She's a child, a pure, sweet child. She didn't even have time to commit any sins. Why are you doing this to us? First, you decided to take away Luz, then Irma. Why? Don't you have enough angels there? Ernesto remembered that dreadful day when he had simultaneously become the father of a lovely baby girl and lost his beloved wife. He had loved his beloved Luz and was ready to do anything for her, especially when she had told him she was pregnant. They were both so happy. Only later, when he was in the shock of terrible grief, almost unable to understand what the elderly doctor with sympathetic eyes was saying to him, he found out that Luz was not allowed to give birth. But she wanted to be a mom so badly, to hold her baby in her arms. She had time to fulfill her cherished dream, looked into her daughter's face, smiled, and quietly left for another world, which is usually called the better world. Ernesto remembered that state of total confusion when he stared dumbly at the red little face peeking out of the blanket. You have a daughter. Look how beautiful she is. The nurse told him, ready to burst into tears. You must live for her sake, do you understand? Have you chosen a name for the baby girl yet? Irma. My wife and I had chosen the name beforehand, Ernesto said. And he finally cried, and it was the only reason his frozen heart didn't burst into tears. The nurse stroked his back, giving him his daughter. Finally, he dared to take the little innocent creature in his arms. And suddenly she opened her huge eyes and looked at him. He felt as if Luz was looking at him right now. Irma, was all he could utter. His daughter blinked, wrinkled her nose, and was about to cry, but changed her mind and sneezed. Bless you, Irma, he said to the baby, and realized that he still had the meaning of life. His sister helped him raise his daughter. When they were kids, he used to bully her all the time. She seemed to him a funny little girl with pigtails, a silly girl who would tell her parents about his little pranks. The difference of 8 years seemed like an abyss. But now Lola was the first who came to their empty apartment, cleaned up the mess, forced him to eat, and fed Irma. Without asking permission, she moved in with him, explaining that someone had to take care of a clueless father and his little baby girl. Lola encouraged her brother and deftly took care of the baby. And that was surprising. Lola had no children, she was still very young. But she wanted to have a baby someday. At the same time, she didn't want to get married, saying she'd rather have a cat, less problems, more fun. Lola appreciated her personal freedom more than anything else in the world and had no intention of limiting it in any way, including her work schedule. Luckily for her, people had invented freelancing, and her excellent brain and ability to use it made it possible for her to quickly become a well-known computer design expert and work wherever she wanted and as much as she wanted. So when Ernesto came to his senses, they decided that he would go back to his job and Lola would babysit Irma. You are used to being in the office, in the company of co-workers, and I need silence. I'm used to working at home, the loving sister explained. Ernesto was very grateful to her, so much so that he apologized for all his childhood pranks, but Lola only said, Come on, we were kids. And you were a boy, all boys like pranks, unlike girls. And then she tried to free herself from his embrace, giggling. And Ernesto stopped by the church that afternoon and lit a candle, according to tradition, in gratitude for having a wonderful sister. His parents also came to help him, but Ernesto realized that he could not rely on them. His mother was very sick, moreover, his parents were already very old. The old people couldn't babysit the baby. But gradually things got better. He worked, and Lola took care of Irma. Irma grew up and ate well. The grief of losing his wife did not go away, but he learned to live without his beloved. And then that cursed day came, when Lola, who went to the hospital with the baby, called, crying into the phone, asking him to come over. Irma. she said, and Ernesto felt cold inside. His hands shook, and he barely understood what his sister was saying through her sobs. They say it's cancer. Now they've taken her away for a checkup. Ernesto rushed to the hospital in a cab, begging the Lord to make the diagnosis a mistake. But no miracle happened. He couldn't believe that his 1-year-old little girl with huge eyes was terminally ill. Then the days filled with endless despair dragged on. Ernesto came to the hospital every day. Lola, skinny and pale, would come out to him, and they would sit and smoke in silence. There was neither good nor bad news. The doctors made no promises. All they could do was pray. Today was one of those days. He had just talked to Lola. The nurse tried to cheer him up, saying something about the wonders of medicine, but then she suddenly cried and ran away. And Ernesto sat in the hospital backyard, staring at one point and searching for cigarettes, which he didn't have. Suddenly someone handed him a cigarette. He looked up and saw the nurse looking at him sympathetically. Nodding gratefully, Ernesto took a cigarette, lit it with the lighter he had found in his pocket, and coughed. "Who do you have in there?" the nurse asked, tapping him on the shoulder a couple of times. "My daughter," Ernesto said. "Very sad," the nurse said, and added unexpectedly, "Finish this cigarette and quit it. You shouldn't smoke here. You know what kind of ward it is. I quit yesterday. I carry it in my pocket out of habit. I promised yesterday." To him? Ernesto looked up. But the nurse shook his head with a serious look. "No," to him, and pointed with his head somewhere to the side. "There he is, my conscience. It's painful to look at this dog. He's sitting and waiting here for a long time. But the woman he's waiting for has died. She got here yesterday and died an hour later. We all knew her well. She used to come here with her dog. She used to bring sweets to sick children. A bright soul, very kind. But now Irma is in the kingdom of the Lord." Ernesto shuddered as if struck by a blow. "Why are you pale, man?" The nurse got worried. "What are you scared of?" "That's my daughter's name. Irma," Ernesto said. "She's been here for a month. My sister is looking after her." "Oh, what a grief." He shook his head. "How old is she?" 1 year old. Ernesto felt a lump in his throat. Why should she suffer such a misfortune? God works in mysterious ways, the nurse crossed himself. Ernesto suddenly felt an attack of rage. Maybe there is no God. He shouted angrily. We've made up something to comfort ourselves. No one needs us there, in heaven. Astronauts fly to other planets, there is no one there. It's your grief that speaks in you, the nurse said sympathetically. It is not where you should look. Look in your heart. Right, Paco? Ernesto felt a touch and lowered his eyes. A shaggy red dog sat at his feet and looked him straight in the eye. Then the dog barked once and went back to its usual place, under the porch of the old hospital building. See, he doesn't approve of your thoughts, the nurse explained. The dog, seriously? Ernesto grinned. This dog is smarter than we are, the nurse said. When Irma was delivered by ambulance, he ran after the car all the way. And when he realized that he couldn't enter the hospital to follow Irma, he crawled under the porch and waited. He didn't eat anything. He just sighed like a human and whimpered. The girls from the kitchen gave him some meat, he didn't even look at it. How can I explain to him that Irma is gone? We chased him away, he won't leave. Are you listening, Paco? Suddenly the dog barked briefly as if he was responding. Ernesto felt uncomfortable, the dog's eyes were so intelligent. We called him Paco, the nurse added. Maybe he's Coco, or Rocky, who knows? The nurse got up from the bench and looked at Ernesto once again. You have to believe. Your daughter is alive, she is fighting. So there is still hope. Hold on, boy. And, turning around, he walked away in the direction of the main building. I'm holding on, Ernesto replied with a sigh, though the nurse didn't hear him. But the dog had heard him instead. A muffled whine came from under the porch. Ernesto got up, walked to the porch, and squatted down. Paco raised his head. The whimpering changed to barking. "Don't be afraid." Ernesto realized he should be more afraid. The dog is so big. If he bites, the wound will be huge. But now the man and the dog had some strange connection. "You see, dog," Ernesto began, trying to speak in a calm voice. "It happens like this. The most dear ones leave and you can't wait for them anymore. They say you have to move on. I have almost succeeded and you will do the same. Run away from here. Maybe you'll have new owners, a nice cozy house, and your own bowl. What do you say?" Ernesto looked under the porch, and his heart burned with a sharp pain. Tears were flowing from the dog's eyes. "Come on, buddy, stop crying." He reached out his hand, touched the red hair, and scratched the dog behind the ear. If only tears could help. Paco crawled out from under the porch, put his head in his lap, and sighed heavily. "Hold on, boy." Ernesto involuntarily repeated the words of the nurse. "I have to go, I'm sorry. I'll come back tomorrow and bring you some treats. Cheer up." The dog looked as if he understood and crawled back under the porch. Ernesto felt a little better. Maybe it was because he had talked to the nurse, who had witnessed too much grief and tears in his life. Or maybe it was because he felt ashamed of the dog. The dog was waiting for a human who would never come back. But he still had a chance. That night Ernesto fell asleep almost immediately for the first time. When Lola and Irma were in the hospital, he almost couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, smoking on the balcony, chasing away dark thoughts, and usually fell asleep only in the morning. Tonight, for some reason he thought of the dog, who remained waiting for his dead human. His eyes were so attentive, so full of longing. "Irma will be all right," he said aloud, just to hear his own voice. He has a very strange dream. He found himself in a room full of people. They stood in silence, waiting for something. One figure caught Ernesto's eye. A young girl in a long white dress with golden hair falling over her shoulders was looking at him as if she wanted to say something. He tried to get closer, but everyone blocked him and pushed him farther away from the girl. For a moment it seemed to him that the stranger was holding the hand of a child, a blond boy about 5 years old. The girl looked at him with a pleading gaze, her lips were stuck together, and couldn't say a word. The boy cried silently. Then the dog appeared, caught Ernesto by the sleeve, and dragged him toward the girl and the child. He almost touched the boy's outstretched hand and woke up. Glancing at his watch, he realized that he had slept for 7 hours and he felt refreshed and full of energy. He also felt as if the cold palm that had been squeezing his heart had slowly let go and allowed him to breathe. Things were going well at work, too. He even made a few jokes with his coworkers. There were whispers behind his back. The cleaning lady whispered, "His daughter must be getting better, thank God. He even looks much better now. God willing, everything will be all right." Ernesto went to the hospital after the end of the working day. On the way, he stopped by the supermarket, got some goodies for his girls, and, following a sudden impulse, got a big bag of dog food. The dog was still there. Ernesto heard the dog whimpering. "Paco, come here," he called to the dog, squatting down and peering under the porch. Paco lay with his head resting on his paws and looked at the man. "Taste it, it's good." Ernesto put some food in the bowl. Paco sniffed and turned away incredulously. "No, buddy, you need to eat something." Ernesto decided to be persistent. "You need energy." The dog turned his shaggy head and sighed loudly. "I saw your human in my dream tonight," he said unexpectedly. "I am sure she wants you to be alive and well. You see, she's worried about you. Buddy, please, eat something." "It won't work," the same nurse said from behind. "We've tried to feed him more than once, but he refuses. He only drinks water. He's completely exhausted. Please, eat at least a little," Ernesto kept urging the dog. He put a few pieces on his palm and held them out to Paco. Your human would like you to eat. She's watching you from heaven. Paco sniffed, glanced at Ernesto, and carefully took a piece from his palm, swallowed, and ate the rest of the food that was on Ernesto's palm. What a miracle! You did it! The nurse was surprised. Not listening to him, Ernesto moved the bowl to the dog. Paco ate greedily. Apparently, he was very hungry. He was a very clever dog. He ate half of it, stopped, and drank some water. Good boy. Ernesto praised him. Your human would be proud of you. Paco moved closer to him and snuggled near his feet. Ernesto began to scratch him behind his ear. Lola ran out to him and caught this picture. Wow! How did you manage to make friends with that grumpy dog? She was surprised, kissing her brother on the cheek and squatting down to pet the dog. Everyone here knows him already. He doesn't let anyone else touch him. We have a deal, Ernesto said with a smile. How is Irma? You know, Lola hesitated for a second, but then continued resolutely, I'm afraid of empty hopes, but I'm sure she's better. She woke up this morning with pink cheeks and asked for food. And she's barking. She's what? Ernesto thought he'd misheard. She is barking, Lola repeated. Like this, aw, aw, aw. Irma was a clever girl. She had been saying the words mommy and daddy for a long time, mumbling something in her own childish language. But after her mother died, she stopped saying anything. She used signs to indicate what she needed. And here's the news, the daughter is barking. Miracles, indeed. Ernesto scratched the back of his head and turned to the dog. Do you understand anything? Paco sneezed as if in agreement. Lola hesitated, thinking whether to say it or not. Then she made up her mind. There's such a strange story here. I think there's a ghost in our building. Lola, are you okay? Ernesto looked at his sister doubtfully. She nodded guiltily. I know how it sounds, she agreed, but I wasn't the only one who saw it. There's a woman in the next room who also said a shadow appears and wanders around the hospital. Nonsense, Ernesto said. I don't think so, Irma looked seriously. I woke up in the middle of the night and she was standing over Irma's crib. I was frightened and got up. The shadow was gone. And Irma was smiling and laughing quietly. Can you believe it? And in the morning she started barking. Do you understand anything? I understand only one thing, that my daughter is getting better. Ernesto looked at the dog. Do you agree? Paco barked in approval. You're going to say I'm crazy, Lola said slowly, looking at the dog. But I think your daughter and the woman who owned the dog are connected somehow. Her name was Irma, too. Perhaps they're right about the souls. If they do exist, then it means her soul hasn't found peace. Maybe she's worried about the dog or about our girl. So she's trying to say something through Irma. I won't say you're crazy, Ernesto said quietly. I'm ready to believe anything right now, as long as my daughter gets better. Lola hugged him, pressing her face into his chest. The nurse sighed behind her and the dog fussed noisily. When can I see her? Ernesto asked quietly. Lola shook her head. You shouldn't, she's very weak yet. Besides, you might be scared, there are all sorts of tubes and drips. I'm used to it, but you shouldn't see Irma like that. You must keep a cool and sober mind. I know it sounds cynical, but you're the only one who's earning money now. I'm trying to work, but I don't have much time, you know. I'll be all right, Ernesto replied calmly. Just tell me, does she really look better? Do we have any hope? There is always hope, Lola tried not to cry. All right, I gotta get back to Irma. Viola, our nurse, is with her now. She's a nice girl. Would you like to meet her? She asked suddenly. Ernesto playfully messed up her hair. Did you find me a fiancé? No, I don't have time for that now. My mind is occupied with something else. Ernesto, life goes on, Lola said seriously. I can't be with you all the time. You should find yourself a partner first, and then give me advice. Ernesto said it in such a way that Lola realized if she says anything else, her brother's gonna be mad. Okay, I should go. She kissed him on the cheek again and turned away. Wait. Take the bags, the goodies. Ernesto stopped her. Lola looked at the bags and gasped. You bought too many snacks again. We can't eat that much. You can share it with other patients or with the nurses. Her brother said sternly and added in a completely different tone of voice. Lola, how else can I thank you for your help? At least let me bring you some goodies. We are family, remember? She smiled, picking up the bags. Let me help you, the nurse offered, watching the scene. The nurse was a young man, but he had already seen many horrors in this life, and the conversation between brother and sister touched his heart. And I'll clean up after the dog. Now Paco will eat if he decided to survive. Watching the two left in the direction of the entrance to the hospital building, Ernesto said, addressing the dog. Take care of them, okay? Paco barked as if he really understood what was said. Ernesto sat down on the bench, looking out the windows. His little girl was lying there, covered with the wires keeping her alive. She was his only joy. All that was left of his beloved wife, their common continuation. And he can't even go there and look at her now. He really wished he could take her illness away, be in the hospital covered in wires instead of his little girl. But fate had different plans. Ernesto was already getting up from the bench, going to leave, when suddenly someone called him. Wait! He looked back. A blonde girl in a blue uniform was hurrying toward him. Hello, I'm Viola, she said, taking a breath. Ernesto's heart squeezed. What did she want to tell him? What news did she bring? Don't worry, Viola shook her head. There is no deterioration. The doctor is sure that the process can be stopped. It's just that Lola has told me so much about you that I dare to ask something. I'm listening. Ernesto was relieved. Viola hesitated, then pulled herself together and spoke. A girl died in our ward. She was very nice, but strange, a bit crazy. According to her papers, she had a son, Martin. She didn't have a child with her, just a dog. Maybe the boy is alone right now. We don't know anything about her and about the boy. I'm really worried. I'd go myself, but I'm on shift, and I can't leave the hospital. I have no one else to ask about it. If I call the police, they'll scare the boy. Maybe he doesn't know what happened to his mom. So I thought, if you have a chance, please go to her apartment. Give me the address, and I'll go. Ernesto realized he couldn't bear to see her suffer from embarrassment. The nurse handed him the note and blushed again. I'm sorry, I really have no one else to ask. I understand. Ernesto felt that the girl was about to burst into tears. Thank you for your kind heart, Viola. The dog suddenly barked 3 times, drawing attention to himself. The nurse turned around. Her eyes widened when she saw the leftover food in the bowl. Did he eat? She wondered happily. All this time he refused. I can't believe it. You did the impossible. With these words, she rushed back. The man and the dog looked at each other. Good girl, Ernesto said to Paco. How does she have the strength and nerve to work here, to let other people's pain and suffering go through her heart? Paco wagged his tail in agreement. Why don't you come with me? Ernesto suddenly suggested. What if the boy is really alone out there? Paco, I think the boy needs you. Your Irma won't come back to you, but you can help her son. Think about it. Paco sighed and whimpered pitifully. I understand, Ernesto replied seriously. But your human gave you an instruction through my daughter. Don't wait for her anymore and help her son. Do you understand? The dog barked 3 times. That's the deal. Ernesto nodded to the dog, inviting him to follow him into the car. Let's go, you can show us the way. The dog seemed to understand him. But he looked back at the hospital as if he doubted whether he was doing the right thing. But he jumped into the car and made himself comfortable in the back seat. The right address was not far from the hospital. Ernesto checked the address written in neat handwriting and looked around, examining the rows of identical gray buildings. Suddenly, Paco helped him. The dog got out of the car and headed toward the nearest building, whining impatiently and looking back at Ernesto. Ernesto followed the dog, convinced that the dog really knew the right way. The right apartment was on the 3rd floor. Ernesto listened. There was silence behind the door. The man rang the bell. No one opened the door. But for some reason, Ernesto imagined a boy standing on the other side of the door, listening breathlessly. "Martin, please open the door," he asked in a soft tone of voice. There was silence behind the door. Paco came closer and barked 3 times. The door immediately opened, and a boy of about 6 years old looked out. He looked scared and brave at the same time. He rushed to the dog, hugging him with both arms. Then he raised his huge eyes to Ernesto. "Where is Mommy?" he asked. "They took her to the hospital. Is she all right? Will you take me to her?" Ernesto felt that he, a big guy, was about to burst into tears from helplessness. He didn't know how to tell the boy something that would turn his life upside down. "May I come in?" he asked instead of answering. "Mommy says we can't let strangers in," the boy explained seriously. "That's right," Ernesto agreed. He almost added that it was not a good idea to open the door to strangers either. But it was not the best time for educational talks now. "But Paco is not a stranger to you, is he?" "Paco?" the boy asked, turning his gaze back to the dog. The dog barked as if in agreement. "Is that his name now? What did your mom used to call him?" Ernesto realized he had said it in the past tense, but it was too late to correct himself. "Just a dog," the boy shrugged. His lips trembled and he stared at Ernesto. "Mister, when is Mommy coming back? Is she very sick?" "You know," Ernesto began, but the boy seemed to understand everything already. His eyes rolled back and he would have fallen to the cold concrete floor if Ernesto hadn't picked him up. He carried the boy into the apartment and the dog followed them in. Putting the boy on the sofa, Ernesto looked around for a first aid kit. Suddenly he realized he didn't know how to bring the child to his senses. The room was shockingly poor, but it was clean and tidy. Paco came to the rescue. He walked up to Martin and licked his face. The boy opened his eyes and asked, "Mom died, didn't she? Is she an angel now?" Ernesto sat down next to him and took his hand. Martin looked at him with eyes full of tears. The dog lay beside him, resting his head on his paws and breathing heavily. "Mister, don't cry," the boy said suddenly, trying hard not to burst into tears. "Mommy said she would become an angel and would always look after me. She said she'd live in a better world without pain and suffering. And she said she'd send a friend to look after me and he'd take care of me. She said you, didn't she? The dog came with you. So Mom was talking about you." "That's right," Ernesto confirmed. "Mom came to me in a dream and explained everything, and Paco the dog showed me the way." Martin looked at the dog and thought, "Let him be Paco, that name suits him." "Mister, what is your name?" he asked suddenly. "Ernesto," the man replied. "You can call me Ernesto." "Okay," Martin agreed and added, "Ernesto, what are we going to do now?" Ernesto was silent for a moment, thinking over the answer. He didn't know what to do now. If he sent the boy to an orphanage, his life would be ruined forever. "First of all, we need to feed you," he decided. "Have you eaten anything?" "Dumplings," the boy nodded. Then he lowered his head and added, "But that was yesterday. I washed the dishes, honestly." "Well done," Ernesto said. "Stay here and I'll cook something." The kitchen was perfectly clean. All the dishes had been washed, but the refrigerator was completely empty. There were some jars of cereal, but Ernesto didn't want to start cooking now. There was only one option. "Get ready, we're going to my place," he said to the quiet boy, returning to the room. Martin nodded, pulling his backpack out of the closet, and began to put his belongings into it. Finally, he put in a small, worn teddy bear and stared at Ernesto. Then they both looked at the dog. "Why are you lying down?" "Pack your belongings," Paco Ernesto said sternly. The dog lifted one ear as if to clarify what he meant, then went to the kitchen and returned with a bowl in his teeth. "Great, we can go." Ernesto tried to speak in a cheerful voice. Martin looked around the room as if saying goodbye, then climbed onto the couch and took the picture of a laughing girl with a baby in her arms off the wall. "I'll take you with me," he said quietly, putting the picture in his backpack. Ernesto shut off the gas and water, turned off the lights, and the three of them headed for the car. If someone asked him now what he was going to do next, he wouldn't be able to answer the question. Paco was the first to jump into the ajar door. Martin settled down beside him in the back seat, hugged the dog, snuggled up to him, and was quiet. Ernesto glanced at them, but they were both quiet. On the way, Ernesto stopped at a cafe and got some food. The food smelled so good that the dog started whining and the boy started swallowing saliva. Ernesto handed both of them a huge sandwich, ignoring all the nutritional tips. Everyone fell silent and ate greedily. Then the car became completely quiet. Ernesto glanced in the mirror and saw that the boy was asleep, his cheek resting against the shaggy dog's side. Paco was dozing too, but one ear was twitching as a sign that the guardian was watching the situation. Ernesto carried the skinny boy, who seemed almost weightless, into his apartment. The dog came after them, sniffed all the corners, and lay down near the entrance, showing that he had chosen his place. Ernesto put the sleeping boy on the sofa, took off his shoes, and left him to sleep, covering him with a blanket. Then he poured water into the dog's bowl, put the purchased food in the refrigerator, and sat on a chair, thinking, what should he do next? No brilliant ideas came to mind, and he decided that he would talk to Lola tomorrow, but in the meantime, he should get some sleep. As he passed the room where he had left the boy, he heard a quiet cry. "Martin, what happened?" he asked quietly, approaching the child. It was hard to think of a more stupid question. Just a couple hours ago he had informed the boy that he was now an orphan. The boy didn't answer, and Ernesto realized that he was crying in his sleep. He sighed and lay down beside him, hugging the boy. The crying stopped. In a minute Ernesto fell asleep. If he had any dreams that night, he didn't remember them. He woke up early in the morning to the feeling that his arm was stiff. When he turned his head, he saw a boy's head on his shoulder and realized that even in his sleep he had been afraid to move and wake the child. He got up slowly and went to make breakfast. He still didn't know what he should do now. Probably he should call somewhere to inform special authorities. What if he has relatives? He doesn't know anything about this boy or his family. Paco entered the kitchen. The dog yawned, wagged his tail, and showed that he had everything under control. It was hard to believe. Just yesterday the dog was longing without his Irma, refusing to eat, and now everything changed. Paco came to him, snuggled into his lap, and whimpered softly. Ernesto looked into his eyes and saw such sadness in them that he was ashamed of his own thoughts. "We'll get through this," he said with a confidence he didn't have. The dog barked briefly. "Good morning," he heard from the door. Ernesto turned around. The boy stood on the threshold of the kitchen and looked at him timidly. "I thought it was just a bad dream, but..." Martin sighed. "I thought I'd wake up and my mom would be home." Streams of tears ran down his cheeks. Ernesto took a napkin, squatted down, and wiped his face. "It's really hard to accept," he said quietly, "that a loved one has gone to another world and will never come back. My wife died a year ago, and I still hope she's waiting at home. Now my daughter is in the hospital. She's a little girl, but she's fighting. You should fight, too. We both have to be strong, you know?" "I'll try," Martin whispered. "Do you have a grandmother or grandfather? Maybe a father?" Ernesto asked cautiously. He realized he might hurt the boy by asking such questions, but he had no choice. The boy shook his head. I had only Mom and the dog, Paco. We got him when he was a puppy. They wanted to drown him, but Mom took him away and yelled at the mister who was drowning the puppy. He got scared, gave us the puppy, and ran away. Believe me, Ernesto said carefully, choosing the right words, your mom will always protect you, even if she's not around. And Paco will, right? The dog barked in agreement. And you? The boy asked hopefully. And me, Ernesto answered. What else could he say, looking into the eyes of a child who was flooded with a wave of grief? Okay, no more sadness. Let's have breakfast. They ate, and Ernesto was glad that he didn't have to go to work today. But he had a lot to think about, and he needed some advice. What if you guys stay home and watch cartoons while I go to the hospital? He asked. Martin thought for a moment, then came over and looked up. Is Mom there, in the hospital? Can I see her? Ernesto felt a chill run down his spine. If the boy's mom died a day ago, her body is now in the hospital morgue. What do they do with such unfortunate people who have no relatives? Probably they bury them at the state's expense. She didn't deserve this. They need to find out where she'll be buried so the boy can visit her. I'll go and find out, okay? The boy sighed, swallowed the lump in his throat, and nodded. So what about the cartoons? Ernesto repeated. Martin looked at him condescendingly. I'm not a little boy. I'd rather read a book. Ernesto nodded. He quickly looked through the bookshelves and pulled out a colorful children's encyclopedia. He remembered how he had laughed when Luz had started buying educational books for children when she was pregnant. His wife looked so happy she was looking forward to reading those books together. Luz didn't have time to fulfill her dream. And now Irma is sick. Enough, he must chase away the sad thoughts. There's no time for that now. Will you read the encyclopedia? Ernesto handed the book to the boy. The boy's eyes lit up, and Ernesto realized that the child will not be bored for a long time. Paco followed him, but at the door he sat down, whimpering as if he couldn't decide what to do. Stay here, okay? Ernesto asked the dog. Martin needs you here. You can't leave the boy alone. Can I count on you? Paco, after a moment's thought, barked and returned to the room. Ernesto texted Lola. However, Sister didn't reply. His heart was pounding anxiously as he found himself in the hospital alley. The first person he saw was Nurse Viola. Don't worry, she said, looking sympathetically at the worried Ernesto. One of the best professors is examining your girl right now. It is a blessing that he has come to our hospital. They say that everyone he has treated successfully recovered. Our sister is there right now. The phone should be off during the treatment, but I saw you arrive from the window. Did you find the boy? The boy's fine. He's at my place now, reading books. Ernesto felt relieved. Surely the nurse knows what she's talking about. If this professor is such a legend, he'll be able to help his daughter. And the dog? Viola looked under the porch. The dog is there too, with Martin. Ernesto smiled. How's Martin? Viola asked cautiously. Probably crying all the time? He's doing fine, though it's hard for him, Ernesto said. He asked when he would be able to see his mother. They're burying her tomorrow, Viola sighed. All the hospital staff donated to bury her properly, with a wreath and flowers. We all knew her. A very strange but nice girl. She came to play with children and talked to old people for hours. They say she was blessed. Everyone who knew her is crying now. Many want to go to the funeral to say their last goodbyes, both medical staff and patients. Ernesto handed her some money. This should be enough for everything you need for the funeral. Viola recoiled as if he were handing her not the money but a snake. I can't take it, she whispered fearfully. If you can't do it yourself, ask someone to help you, Ernesto shook his head. I need to see Lola and then go home. The boy is all alone out there, well, with a dog. Oh, isn't it Lola? Viola suddenly asked, pointing to the window. Ernesto turned around. He saw Lola standing near the window, and she was holding Irma. Ernesto exclaimed. It seemed that he had not seen his daughter for such a long time. She was also waving to him and seemed to be smiling. He wanted to believe she was smiling. I guess I was right, Viola's voice sounded happy. She'll be all right now. I will go and stay with the baby, so Lola can come here and talk to you. His sister rushed out to him as soon as she was able to hand Irma to the nurse. She looked excited and happy. Ernesto, you don't know what kind of man that doctor is. He's a tough guy. Everyone is afraid of him, but the children like him very much. He's like a magician. There is so much magic and charm in him. Lola, have you fallen in love? Ernesto laughed. His sister stopped talking, blushed, and said, No. He's old, he's about 40, and he's probably married. Find out if he's married, Ernesto teased her and asked in a more serious tone. What did he say about Irma? He said that the dynamics are positive and there is hope for a full recovery, Lola answered sharply, changing her tone. He said that? Ernesto asked again. I asked him the same thing, Lola nodded. And he looked at me from under his glasses and said sternly, Young lady, if Rodriguez says that the patient will recover, there can be no doubt. I really want to believe him. So do I, Ernesto echoed. Lola, there is one more thing we need to discuss. He briefly explained the situation. Lola thought about it, bit her lip, and suddenly said, Maybe that's what Irma wanted to say when she started barking. Well, not she, but the other Irma, the boy's mom. Lola, you always like to read fiction, Ernesto shook his head but didn't object. Maybe you are right, but still, what should I do with the boy? The simplest solution is to call the guardianship authorities. You can take the dog to a shelter. Lola said. Ernesto shook his head negatively. I see, that's not an option, Lola said. Then I'll have to take the boy. You live with us and babysit Irma, remember? Besides, we'll probably need some official papers. They wouldn't give the boy to a single woman. They won't give the boy to a single man either. Lola objected. Ernesto, are we seriously talking about this now? He's a stranger to us. Ernesto hesitated and froze. He realized that he was really ready to adopt this boy, even though he didn't know about him until yesterday. Miracles. I have a better chance, he said stubbornly. A steady paycheck and a place to live. No way, Lola shook her head. You need to find a wife. Lola, don't pour salt on my wound, Ernesto smiled sadly. No one can replace Luz. Besides, I'm not sure I could find a woman who would agree to take care of 2 kids and a dog. We need a sham marriage, Lola insisted. I think I have one candidate, but don't say no right away. I'll talk to her, okay? All right, Ernesto said. Anyway, you will not succeed. Better help Viola. We need to bury Martin's mom properly. Sure, I'll help her, his sister agreed and added unexpectedly. Viola is a good girl, isn't she? She is, Ernesto agreed. And then he realized what Lola was trying to say. Lola, are you crazy? Don't even think about it. Why? His sister asked. I think she's the perfect candidate. Because you can't do that. She's really a very good girl, and she deserves a real family and happiness, Ernesto argued. Don't even try to ruin her life. Let's ask her first, Lola insisted. Anyway, I have to go. Lola, is Irma really better? Ernesto asked. The sister nodded seriously. I think you can visit her very soon. Is she asking about me? Ernesto felt hope returning to him. She says daddy all the time, Lola confirmed. I hope we'll go home soon. Ernesto looked at the windows of the hospital building for a long time after his sister had left. However, he didn't see Lola with the girl in her arms. He didn't see Viola either, though he thought of her. Instead, he saw a familiar nurse. He was holding the large bag of dog food. "This is the dog food you bought yesterday. I think you'll need it now," he said. "Everyone says Paco has found a new home." "That's true," Ernesto answered briefly. The nurse looked at him intently, apparently hesitating to ask. "Does the boy live with you?" he asked cautiously. "Viola said that our blessed lady had a son." "Yes," Ernesto smiled, taking the bag of food from his hands. "How could I separate a boy and a dog? They have to live together." "And then what?" the nurse asked uncertainly. "I don't know. We'll figure it out later," Ernesto shrugged. The nurse looked at him with a long, attentive stare and crossed him suddenly. "You'll see, you'll be rewarded for helping an orphan." Ernesto felt uncomfortable. The nurse spoke very confidently, and Ernesto was afraid of empty hopes. "Well, I have to go," he said. Then he noticed that the nurse was looking carefully at the ground around the bench. "Hey, what are you doing?" He was interested in such strange behavior. The nurse smiled and explained. "Not a single cigarette, but..." Ernesto realized that for all this time he had not smoked a single cigarette. Miracles! He was surprised. "Exactly," the nurse agreed and patted him on the shoulder. "Go, they are waiting for you at home. And don't worry about your daughter, the best doctor is treating her." Ernesto did not believe in miracles. Nevertheless, he returned home in a much more cheerful mood. Paco met him at the door, wagging his tail. When he returned to the boy, his behavior had completely changed. All sadness was gone. The dog was happy. Martin had left the room, too, and was now looking at him shyly, though he was obviously glad to see him. "Hi, guys," Ernesto said cheerfully. "What have you been up to?" "I read, then I cleaned the apartment." "Paco helped me," Martin reported. "Mentally?" Ernesto clarified. The boy thought for a moment and shook his head. "He's a very smart dog. He can take the slippers back to their place." "That's great," Ernesto smiled. Paco, hearing that they were talking about him, barked, sniffed Ernesto's feet, and deftly took his slippers out of the shoe rack. "You're really smart, buddy," Ernesto laughed, "but thank you for your care." "Ernesto," Martin pulled his sleeve. "I cooked dinner, pasta and sausages. You must be hungry." Ernesto felt as if everything inside him had turned upside down. He felt warmth and compassion. The boy, who had lost his mother, was able to find the strength to take care of a stranger, to thank him. "I'm really very hungry," Ernesto said, swallowing a lump in his throat. "I'm ready to eat a huge plate of pasta." The three of them headed for the kitchen. The stove was wiped clean, the sink was washed. A pot of sausages was on the stove, and a second pot was filled to the top with pasta. Ernesto saw that the pasta was dry, but he didn't want to hurt the feelings of the boy, who was trying very hard to make a delicious dinner. Ernesto simply added butter to the pasta, and then cut the sausages nicely, making funny octopuses of them. The dinner turned out to be quite edible, and Ernesto informed the pleased boy about it. But the joy did not last long. Martin was sad again, so Ernesto sat up next to him, hugging him. "Tears will not relieve the pain," he said quietly, so as not to scare away the fragile trust that had just been established between them. "You have to go on living. Mom is happy up there in heaven now, seeing that you are okay. You're going to send me to the orphanage, aren't you?" Martin suddenly asked. "I have no one now, only a dog." Paco, hearing that they were talking about him, raised his head and stared at them. "I don't think so. Maybe we can think of something more interesting." Ernesto didn't want to give the boy false hope, though he had made up his mind. Martin's lips trembled. Ernesto put his arms around the boy. He shuddered again and tried to pull away, but then he pressed himself tighter and burst into tears. "Come on, everything will be all right," Ernesto said, stroking his hair. The dog got up from his seat and came over to them. So the three of them sat there, united in their grief. Ernesto realized that no words could help to comfort the boy. 10 minutes later, when the boy calmed down a bit, Ernesto took a handkerchief out of his pocket and handed it to the boy. He took it silently, wiped his face, and looked at Ernesto. "Hold on, brother," Ernesto said quietly. "We still have to get through tomorrow with dignity, and then it will be easier." They spent the evening together. Martin was reading the pages of a children's encyclopedia. Paco lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, occasionally glancing at both of them. Ernesto was surfing the internet, looking for articles about adoption and foster care. Feeling like his head was about to explode, he decided to get some rest. "Guys, let's go to bed," he suggested, yawning. "Sit with me for a while," Martin asked him. Ernesto nodded and sat down next to the boy, thinking about the twists and turns of fate. Not so long ago, all his thoughts had been focused on his sick daughter, and now he was worrying about a boy and a dog he found accidentally. And most importantly, it seems to be the right and the only possible solution. Making sure that Martin was asleep, Ernesto went to his room. He was almost asleep when he got a video message on his phone. His still pale but clearly cheerful daughter was babbling, "Daddy, Daddy," and waving at him. "Don't let us down, Professor Rodriguez," Ernesto whispered. "Save my little girl." At night he dreamed of something good and warm, and in that dream there was that girl again, Martin's mother. She smiled and said that everything would work out. Now she knew that for sure. The next day the cemetery was unexpectedly crowded. Not only the doctors and nurses, but also many patients came. They all loved Irma. Many people were crying. Ernesto squeezed the boy's hand tighter. Martin stared at the open coffin. "I can't," he whispered, struggling. "I'm afraid." Ernesto was about to say that there was no need to say goodbye, that the boy had had enough of the shock, but someone's warm hand touched his palm. He looked back and saw Viola. The girl squatted down in front of Martin and spoke affectionately. "You need to say your last goodbyes, dear. Let your mom go, otherwise she'll worry about you and won't be able to be happy in heaven." Martin sighed, closed his eyes, pulling himself together, then reached out his hand to Viola and looked at Ernesto. Ernesto took his other hand. The three of them walked toward the coffin. People parted, giving way to them. They came very close in silence, and Ernesto found the strength to look at the deceased. The girl was still beautiful, even after her death. Her face was soft and peaceful. "Mommy, don't leave me," Martin whispered. "Don't cry, dear," Viola said softly. "You have to let your mother go, but she will stay in your heart forever, believe me." Martin found the strength to kiss his mother on the forehead and stepped back, snuggling into Viola's arms. Ernesto thought Irma's lips trembled, but of course, it was only his imagination. Something large and shaggy squeezed between them. Paco approached the coffin. The dog stared at his dead owner for a long time, whimpering and staring at her. Ernesto saw tears roll from the dog's eyes. After that, Martin didn't cry again. He didn't cry even when the coffin was buried. He kept looking away, whispered something, then smiled. "What are you looking at, Martin?" Viola asked worriedly. "Mommy is standing there," Martin explained without turning around. "She doesn't talk, but I can hear her, can't you?" Ernesto looked in the direction the boy was pointing, and for a second he saw a white silhouette that radiated love and kindness. "I am grateful to you, Ernesto," he heard someone else's thoughts. "I know you will not abandon my boy. And you should know that your daughter will recover. Let your wife go, as my son let me go. One day, all those who love each other will be together in a world without pain and suffering. But for now, she wants you to be happy. Live your life to the fullest, and let new love into it. I have to go now, goodbye." Ernesto blinked, and when he looked again at the place where he had seen the girl in white, there was no one there. Paco went to that spot and lay down with his head on his paws. "Let's go home," Ernesto called out to him. The dog sighed but remained lying down. "Paco, let's go," Martin called to him. But the dog did not respond. Viola saved the situation. The nurse resolutely approached the dog, squatted down, stroked him, and talked to him. Paco raised his head, carefully looked at her. The boy and the man standing nearby stood up and obediently went to them. "What did you say to him?" Ernesto wondered. Viola shrugged. "Asked him to look after you. I think Paco's ready to fulfill my request." Ernesto stared at her, then looked at Martin, who was stroking the dog. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Let's step aside." They stepped back. Suddenly Viola took out the money and wanted to give it to Ernesto. "I didn't spend much, here's the rest of the money." Ernesto shook his head. "That's not what I wanted to talk about. Please don't say no right away, okay?" Viola listened carefully to his confused explanation. Her face expressed confusion and doubt. "Are you talking about a sham marriage?" she asked, pulling herself together. Ernesto lowered his head. "I know it sounds terrible, but it's the best way to convince the guardianship authorities that I can be his father. Otherwise, Martin would have a very unhappy life." Viola thought for a moment, then lifted her chin proudly. Ernesto was sure she would refuse, but the girl replied, "Okay, I agree, we can apply today." Ernesto didn't even have time to be surprised and ask anything, but the girl turned around and walked towards the hospital. "Martin, how are you?" he asked the boy, though it was hard to think of a more stupid question. The boy looked at him seriously. "Paco feels really bad, he's a dog. He doesn't understand that Mom is in heaven now. He loved her very much. He doesn't know how to live without her." "We will help him," Ernesto said firmly. "We'll all be together now." "The three of us?" Martin asked. "Nope," Ernesto sat down next to the boy. "We also have Irma and Lola. You'll have a little sister now." "A little sister?" Martin said slowly. "What do you mean?" "You'll meet her soon," Ernesto said, smiling. "Ernesto," a familiar voice called out to him. He looked back and saw Lola coming towards him with a stroller. "Irma!" He rushed to his daughter. He felt like he hadn't seen his little girl for ages. "Daddy!" The little girl said loudly and pointed her finger behind his back. "There's aw. My clever girl, sadness has been replaced by joy. Yes, this is our dog, and this is Martin, your brother." "Martin," the daughter said carefully and laughed. "What a wonderful reunion," said a tall man in a white uniform and glasses. Ernesto didn't pay attention to him at first. There are indeed many miracles in this story, even though I don't believe in miracles. "Ernesto, this is Professor Rodriguez Gil," the blushing Lola explained. "You can call it Gil," the professor added, who turned out to be much younger than Ernesto had imagined from his sister's stories. "Soon you'll be able to take your daughter home. Her sudden recovery is a mystery to medicine. We'll keep her under observation, but the girl is almost cured." "It's not a mystery, it's a miracle." Lola put her hand over his mouth. The professor took her hand and kissed it. Lola blushed again, and Ernesto realized that there was more than one miracle. They returned home with mixed feelings. Ernesto realized that it was not appropriate to be so obviously happy in front of a boy who had just buried his mother. However, he was now confident that soon his daughter would come home, which meant that not only troubles were ahead, but also changes for the better. When Martin fell asleep, he texted Lola and asked for Viola's phone number. "Viola, hello, are you awake?" He realized that this was a very stupid way to start a conversation, but she answered, "I'm awake, I'm thinking about our conversation today." "I am thinking about it too." Ernesto didn't even wonder why she didn't ask who was calling. Everything seemed so natural. After all, he was not the only one who felt a thin thread stretching from heart to heart. "Have you changed your mind?" Viola's voice trembled. "Of course not." Ernesto tried to choose the right words. "It's just that the offer was so unexpected. I must have frightened you." "Not at all," Viola seemed to smile. I'm sorry for such a sudden proposal, but the situation is critical. I didn't even ask if you are single. Ernesto realized how surprising it was that she had agreed right away. I am single, Viola answered and added. A year ago, I broke up with a man who seemed to be the meaning of my life. I planned to start a family, to have children, but he betrayed me. He did not even deny that he cheated on me. He explained that men are polygamous by nature and nothing can be done about it. I chased him away and decided that I would no longer try to build a relationship based on feelings. So your proposal suits me just fine. Ernesto was convinced that she didn't believe herself. Viola, he said cautiously, what if something that starts as a sham marriage, for the sake of a child, turns into something real? Maybe someone up there decided to give a chance not only to the boy but to the three of us? Then it's four, Viola said after a moment's silence. You forgot about Paco. He needs a home, too. And love, she said this word uneasily, and Ernesto felt how much suffering this fragile girl experienced. She had lost faith in the possibility of simple human happiness. And now, he gave himself a promise to try to fix the mistake and convince her that a miracle is really possible. Life was slowly getting better. Ernesto had never imagined that there were so many people in the world who were ready to help them. Martin was accepted into the kindergarten. Their neighbor, a stern-looking old lady, offered to walk Paco. Ernesto was afraid of her and felt like a guilty schoolboy when he met her in the neighborhood. But now this stern old lady rang the doorbell herself and then said, Do you remember who said, we are responsible for those we tame? Exupery, Ernesto replied, slightly stammering, like a schoolboy. Then be good enough to comply. The neighbor said, Give me the keys, I'll walk, feed, and train your huge dog. Flora, I'm grateful to you, but it would take too much of your time, Ernesto tried to object. But it was impossible to stop an old lady who decided to do something good. She glared at him and repeated, Just give me the keys. The dog needs regular walks, or it will be a disaster. Besides, her strict teacher's face showed something like a smile. The doctor prescribed me to walk and exercise. So we'll combine the useful things. Are you sure? Ernesto was still trying to resist. I'm sure, it's not a problem, she said. It was indeed a solution to the problem. And Ernesto obeyed it. And now, coming home together with Martin, he found not only a satisfied, well-fed Paco but also unexpected bonuses such as a pot of hot soup or a houseplant. One day he rang his neighbor's doorbell and handed her a bouquet of flowers and chocolates. Flora thanked him, brushed away a tear, and invited him into the apartment. Ernesto found himself in a sparkling clean apartment, too big for a single woman. There were pictures on the walls. Each one showed a man in a military uniform. That's Roberto, my husband, the neighbor explained. He died abroad. He died saving other people. Now I try to help others too, and I don't know what happens after I die. I wonder if I will meet Roberto or not. Don't think about death, you have something to live for, Ernesto said quietly. Thank you very much for your help. So, you didn't understand anything, the neighbor sighed. I needed it much more than you needed my help. Loneliness is a terrible curse, remember that. Take care of your loved ones. Back in his apartment, Ernesto thought about her words for a long time. Then he dialed a familiar number. Viola, don't say no right away, okay? He asked Viola. Move in with me. I'm sure it will work out. But your daughter is being discharged tomorrow, and Lolo will live with you again, Viola started, but Ernesto didn't let her finish. I don't think Lolo will live with me anymore if her personal life has changed tremendously, he said, choosing his words carefully. If you are ready to take care of the children, I promise that I will provide you with everything you need. But what about my job? You'll go back to it when the children are older. Of course, only if you want to, Ernesto said and then added abruptly. Or maybe we'll have 3 children by then. Ernesto, what are you talking about? He imagined her cheeks flushed. I'm saying that I think I love you, and I'm ready to live with you for the rest of my life, unless you have other plans, he finished. I think it's worth a try. Ernesto thought she was about to disconnect, but she said, "Let's try." And then she disconnected. The next day was full of emotions and excitement. His daughter came home with a lot of guidance, what to feed her, when to walk, and what medications to give her until she recovered. Lola talked nonstop, always mentioning her brilliant professor. They seemed to have something serious going on, especially since the professor was divorced and had avoided women for a long time. But Lola managed to melt his icy heart. "I will come to you every day to help you. And you'll ruin my family life," Ernesto grinned, putting his arm around Viola's shoulders. "Now you have your own personal happiness, you deserve it." "You can't cope without me," Lola said, turning to the dog. "Right, Shaggy?" Paco sneezed and shook his head instead of answering. "Seriously?" Lola pretended to be indignant. "Paco, I didn't expect that from you. We won't be able to do it without you, but we need to get used to each other, not just rely on help, even if it's from family," Viola added. "Isn't Viola smart?" Lola looked at her brother and winked. He nodded affirmatively. Irma, busy with toys, raised her head, stretched out her hand, and demanded, "Daddy." "Yes, my sunshine." "Daddy is here," Ernesto answered. Then Irma turned towards Viola and said clearly, "Mommy, eat." Tears flowed from Viola's eyes, but she smiled at the little girl and said, "Sure, my dear, we will eat now." In the evening, when the children were sleeping peacefully, Viola stopped in the bedroom doorway in confusion. Ernesto realized what she was thinking and what she was afraid of. He put his arm around her shoulders and whispered in her ear, "This is what we both want, isn't it? If I'm wrong, I'll go to sleep on the couch." Viola shook her head. She trembled as Ernesto began to kiss her gently. But his lips were warm and gentle. "Mommy!" They both flinched when they heard Martin scream out. Viola ran into his room. Ernesto followed her. "What happened, son?" Viola asked him anxiously. Martin sat up in bed and blinked. "I had a terrible dream," he finally explained. Viola sat down beside him and put her arms around him. The boy calmed down, and then they both heard what he whispered. "Can I call you Dad and Mom?" "Of course, you can." Ernesto felt a lump in his throat. "You are our son, Martin," Viola concluded, hugging him. Paco grumbled in the corner. "Well, you are our son, too," Ernesto said, looking at Paco. "But you're grown up now, so you'll help us take care of the kids, deal?" Paco barked as if to say yes. All three of them laughed. "I'll stay with you, try to fall asleep," Viola said. Martin nodded, snuggling up next to her. Ernesto returned to the bedroom and lay down on the bed. His heart was pounding. He was filled with joy and boundless love for all the people he now called by the common word family. And then Viola was back, warm and gentle, with silky skin and hot lips, and he realized that he really loved her. Because only loving people can give each other such bliss, such happiness, it seems that their life began from scratch. And looking at the face of his beloved woman who was sleeping peacefully, Ernesto suddenly realized that he had begun to believe in miracles.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.